Good afternoon and good morning to our West Coast participants. This is Pranitha Gupta from the Center for Law and Social Policy. On behalf of CLASP and the Center for Innovation and Worker Organization at Rutgers, I would like to welcome you to our Labor Standards Enforcement webinar on monitoring strategies. Our guest presentation is going to be from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, a worker-based human rights organization that has worked for more than 20 years to improve the lives of farm workers in the Florida tomato industry, and the Fair Food Standards Council, which oversees implementation of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers Fair Food Program. We're very excited to have so many participants on today's call from 12 cities and counties, 9 states, and the United States Department of Labor, and over 15 advocacy and funder and research organizations. This call is being recorded today, and therefore we have everybody on mute. However, we definitely want to have a robust conversation and welcome questions throughout the presentations. We ask that you use the chat function on the webinar to ask your questions. You can type in your question. Just be clear which presenter you are addressing the question to, and if it's addressed to all the presenters, just note that. We will, as soon as you ask the question, we will forward it to the presenters, and we will make sure that your question is asked during the Q&A section of the program. We hope you'll enjoy the program, and now I'm going to pass it on to Janice Fine. Janice?
Hello, everyone. So glad you're on the call. This program is actually in response to requests that many of you made. Many public agencies have been quite curious about how the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and the Fair Food Standards Council, the best of on-the-ground private monitoring in the United States, actually function, and what some lessons might be for public agencies, or some good ideas for public agencies. So first, I want to call your attention to a short real-time survey that we're putting up right now. It consists of 2 questions, but you'll get them one at a time. The first one is, do you currently conduct any form of monitoring, including compliance monitoring, as an agency? And we just need you to select the answer. In a little while, we'll put up the second question. So let me just say a little bit about monitoring. One thing that people don't realize is that actually a lot of although we think of monitoring now as being a global phenomenon, actually started here in the mid-1990s. American and European apparel and footwear brands and retailers started adopting codes of conduct and auditing compliance in their global supply chains. Often this was in response to anti-sweatshop campaigns that named and shamed companies for labor exploitation within their contracting and subcontracting supply chains. So this rise of private regulation built on earlier initiatives in the US, in which federal and state labor departments turned to private monitoring to police garment districts in New York and Los Angeles, and earlier monitoring projects in the global production of toys and sports and sporting goods and hand-woven rugs. And over time, this private regulation, as we all know, has spread to a number of other global industries, including electronics, home furnishings, jewelry, seafood, and labor-intensive agriculture. In private regulatory systems, brands and retailers either develop their own standards for suppliers or agree to promote or require standards that have been developed by multi-stakeholder groups. These private codes have helped to improve basic working conditions and health and safety protections in some locations, but complex supply subcontracting networks and intense price pressures and the movement of orders to new locations has basically meant that in many cases, harsh and dangerous conditions have remained the norm. Participation by brands and retailers is voluntary. So the failure of private regulation has fueled recent attempts to promote a worker-driven model of corporate social responsibility. At its core, this means incorporating worker organizations and community organizations into the setting of standards and the monitoring of compliance. So rather than relying on checklist auditing done by representatives of a brand or a social auditing company that are far, far away, worker-driven models seek to establish a permanent on-the-ground presence and draw on the knowledge and the trust of workers and their organizations. And here there's a parallel with the co-enforcement model we've discussed on in other webinars. One increasingly prominent approach that was created by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers was to forge binding, legally enforceable agreements between corporations and worker representatives, in which companies commit in writing to particular standards and remediation processes. Immokalee is the epicenter of Florida's enormous tomato industry. It's a $520 million industry, accounts for half of all tomatoes produced in the US market, 30,000 workers, and has been the site of enormous exploitation of low-wage, largely immigrant workers and people of color. And the tomato fields have been notorious for violence and sexual harassment, unsafe work, wage theft, and in the most extreme cases, human trafficking and indentured servitude, slavery. They have been completely transformed by the work of the two organizations that are going to speak now. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers has literally rewritten the script for labor monitoring. The Fair Food Program is a unique partnership among growers, farm workers, and food retailers and restaurant chains that ensures humane wages and working conditions for the workers who pick fruits and vegetables on participating farms. Instrumental to implementation of the Code of Conduct is their partner, the Fair Food Standards Council, a dedicated local enforcement arm based within proximity to the tomato fields in Sarasota, Florida. Fair Food Standards Council is directed by a former New York State Supreme Court Justice who we'll hear from today, Laura Safer-Espinosa, and has 14 full-time bilingual investigators. They also have a certified public accountant who verifies that workers are being paid the correct fair food premium. In our view, we can learn a lot from the CIW about strategic enforcement, not only about monitoring. And with that, I will go ahead and introduce our speakers. I think the second question should be going up now for you to answer. Our speakers are Greg Asbed, who is the co-founder of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and a 2017 winner of MacArthur Genius Prize. Gerardo Reyes, a worker leader in the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, who is featured prominently in the work of the organization globally in the US and in Food Chains, a film some of you might have seen, and Judge Laura Safer-Espinosa, the Executive Director of the Fair Food Standards Council and a former New York State Supreme Court Judge. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our friends at the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and the Fair Food Standards Council and thank them so much for doing this with us.
Thank you so much. My name is Gerardo, and I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about where we come from, very briefly. As you know, Immokalee is epicenter for the agricultural industry, tomato being the most important and powerful of all of them. And the reality from which we emerged as an organization is a reality of abusive conditions that I'm going to talk in a little bit. We did many actions to try to bring the growers to the table. Among them, strikes with more than 3,000 workers each time. There was a hunger strike of 30 days. And with all of these actions, workers were aiming to have a place on the table to talk about how to eliminate situations of sexual harassment, wage theft, of wages that were stagnant since 1978 and for the next 3 decades. So the beginnings of the coalitions were, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers were aiming to have that solution by working together with the growers. But we realized that that was not going to happen because of the refusal of the growers that were basically saying that they will never sit at the table when the hunger strike was going on. One of them say, when asked about why not, I'm going to put it to you this way. A tractor doesn't tell a farmer how to run his farm. That was the perception that the growers had of the farm workers, that they formed part of their industry, but they were not recognized or viewed as human beings. So two main goals that we had as an organization were to be able to change the balance of power between workers and our employers, and to also address the supervisory wages. If you think about that as the two rails that will help us advance our fight to guarantee protections to our human rights and our dignity. After those initial years, the coalition started to analyze the market, taking into account that the incredible growth of corporations that 4 to 5 decades ago didn't really exist with the power that they exist today, were able to grow at a pace that was demanding more and more production at a lower and lower price from the growers, who were not doing anything in terms of how workers were treated. They actually were in constant denial that those abuses were going on. So we realized that what the big food retail industry called the power of the purchasing order was being used to maximize profit and to create this downward pressure that the growers needed to then accommodate somewhere. They were not going to lose their profits, but they needed to cut costs of production in order for that to be the case. So they did it by keeping our wages stagnant. In terms of the abusive conditions, they were exacerbated by the fact that none of the buyers were doing anything with the power they had to demand anything related to protection for workers. They were demanding high quality. They were dictating the prices in benefit of their own economy. And they were also able to dictate the texture, the size, and all of those things, but never human rights for workers. So in that moment, we realized that it was time to analyze that and to create our theory of change. That was basically that if the power of the purchasing order it's used without responsibility, those are the conditions that we very well know because we experience them, but they also hold the solution if used correctly in the supply chain. So we knew that, and we decided that it was time to begin organizing with consumers across the nation to create the campaign for fair food by bringing consumers to our side and asking corporations to do business in a different way with the final goal of connecting at the growers level the human rights with their ability to do business. That was the theory. So that's how we started. And the problem that we have seen, as you can see on the slide, has generated a lot of news. There was Rape in the Fields story that came out on PBS, and they actually, in terms of the program, they were not able to find cases of rape because we have found a solution, which we will hear more about later. But those stories continue to happen everywhere. The stories of people being forced to work gunpoint in the cases of modern-day slavery, the stories that continue to emerge depicting a modern version of the harvest of shame, the 50 years later. All of that is part of the problem that we as workers suffer. When you look at the list that you have in front of you now, you can identify what I was saying earlier, the two main issues that we needed to tackle, which is the subpoverty wages that were 40 to 45 cents for more than 3 decades, and the imbalance of power between workers and their employers that translated into all of these lists where we see situations of modern-day slavery. There's been 9 investigations that have involved the Department of Justice, the FBI. In some cases, we had to work undercover to help workers escape. One of the last cases that happened here in Immokalee involved workers who were forced to sleep inside a cargo truck. They didn't have access to a bathroom. So if they needed to use a bathroom, they would have to go in the corner of the same place where they were sleeping, stripped off completely of their humanity. They were also chained literally inside the truck to make an example for the rest of the crew. So those are some of the most brutal situations. Workers in that case escaped, came to our office. Some of them went to talk to the police, and that resulted in the conviction of the family that had these workers under this situation. There was, for the first time, a connection that was made between these conditions and some of the growers that said they will never sit at the table with us, along with situations of sexual harassment that have happened. It's estimated that 80% of women in the fields have suffered any kind of sexual violence. So that is something that has happened across the entire industry, and that is also part of the huge problem that we confront. So in analyzing the problem and with different moments in which we have brought these cases resulting in more than 1,200 workers that have been freed from these conditions, 15 bosses going to jail because of this, we were talking prior to the creation of the program of an issue that required that kind of approach, but that was limited by the fact that the application of law, the working together with law enforcement in some cases, the DOJ, FBI, was basically doing the job after people's dignity had already been crushed after the fact of going through these very horrible situations. So perhaps Lou DeBaca, former ambassador at large to monitor and combat trafficking in person from the U.S. Department of State, put it in a really good way. He said, we cannot prosecute our way out of the problem, referring to modern day slavery. And he was right. And that's why we were aiming by creating these agreements with corporations like Taco Bell, McDonald's, Burger King, Subway, and all the food retail industry. We were aiming to bring them to the table to then have enough power to bring the change, the systemic change that needed to take place on the tomato industry. So part of the problem in this is that we need more and more corporations to sign. Until now, we have 14 different corporations that have signed onto the Fair Food Program. So now I'm going to go to the next slide, please. And this is where all of these efforts after the campaign for Fair Food started in 2001, and after 4 years led to an agreement with Taco Bell. Then after that, agreements with 13 other corporations, including McDonald's, Burger King, Subway, even Walmart. That kind of power now is standing on the side of the worker. The power of the purchasing order gave us the opportunity and the leverage to be able to then sit with the growers who said the tractor doesn't tell a farmer how to run his farm. And for the first time, it was the tractors telling the farmer how to run his farm in regards to social responsibility. And with the creation of the Fair Food Program, which is basically something that includes all the rights that we see constantly stepped on by the industry, and having to face a huge question for us. Prior to the program, you would have to ask yourself, do I try to defend my dignity knowing that I'm going to be fired and therefore lose my ability to feed my kids? Or do I keep quiet and keep working? Many abuses would go undetected because that was the reality. And now with the the corporations on our side, we have been able to flip the question, because now the growers have to ask themselves, do we protect this crew leader, this supervisor who's harassing women on my company, or treating workers in a violent way, taking their wages and all of that, knowing that the market consequences will probably kick in as soon as that is uncovered, will kick in. And the answer for a grower is the choice they have is to participate with the program. So as part of the solution, the market-based worker-driven social responsibility program, our participation from the community was the creation of the program, of all the rights included. But and what that means is that we now go to the fields. They have to give us full access. And when a worker is hired now, the companies have to give them booklets with the rights that they are now going to be receiving, and also showing them a video that's an enacting of all of those rights for people that might not be able to read or write. So we do that with education sessions, wall-to-wall, worker-to-worker, in company property and in company's time. The Fair Food Program was implemented in 2011 with an agreement signed with the Florida Tomato Growers Exchange, which represents 90% of the tomato industry. And that's where it all began. So I'm going to stop here. I know Judge Lara is going to enter a little bit more in details about how the program works.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Eduardo, if you can move to the next slide, that would be great. So the incredible story that Gerardo has just related brought about the legally binding agreements that the coalition of Immokalee Workers now holds with participating growers and participating buyers in the Fair Food Program. And those legally binding agreements say two simple things. One is that participating buyers will pay a premium for their produce, which will be passed along to workers who, and it will be used to supplement sub-poverty wages that were stagnant for 3 decades. And also of critical importance is that they will purchase only from farms that are certified by the coalition's monitoring organization to be compliant with the Fair Food Code of Conduct. Growers, for their part, sign and agree to pass along that premium to workers and to implement the code on their farms. So simple structure, and it has given birth to amazing results. To truly understand the Fair Food Program, you have only to think about what would a social responsibility program look like if workers got to design it. And as I think you've heard in Gerardo's presentation, workers are the ones who are always present when their rights are being violated, so they are the true expert in how, when, and where those violations take place. So the Fair Food Code of Conduct takes the law as a baseline standard, and it goes from there and calls from workers' actual experiences on the farms. So just to mention a few things that go beyond the law in the Code of Conduct that have undercut the ability for the worst abuses that Gerardo talked about to take place now. I'm going to run through a few of those for you now. Direct hire. Workers get checks in their own names from the company. In other words, a participating grower must put those workers on the company payroll, and they receive checks in his or her own name. And this is hugely important in terms of undercutting the ability of labor contractors and illegal subcontractors to hold people in forced labor situations. then I'm sure our friends at DOL will appreciate as well that the code requires time registration devices that workers control and that generate a verifiable record. Manual records that are easily manipulable, and according to the head of DOL's regional enforcement for Southeast agriculture, are one of the greatest sources of wage theft in the field. They just simply cannot be used in the Fair Food Program. Changes in harvesting standards were implemented, including eliminating the requirement to overfill buckets, which had been traditionally a traditional source of wage theft, in which workers were forced to heap an extra 4 or 5 pounds on every bucket, meaning that they were giving away every 8 to 10 buckets, they were giving away a bucket. That was eliminated, resulting in approximately a 10% wage increase. Zero tolerance for sexual harassment with physical contact of any kind was implemented for an offense that was so prevalent that that kind of a standard that went way beyond the penal law standard had to be implemented. The right to participate in worker health and safety committees where direct dialogue with management on work environment and health and safety issues takes place, mandatory shade in the fields at all times and places that qualifying work is done, and of course the fair food premium. Now, as Gerardo was mentioning, workers, when they come on Fair Food Program farms, the next element that a worker-driven social responsibility program would want to see implemented is to have education on workers' rights that is as deep and as wide as possible. So when workers step on that farm, they're given a Fair Food Program booklet that was written by the coalition and a video that also is scripted and written by farm workers and informs them of their rights in ways that are very understandable and relatable. That process of education, which is reinforced by the coalition's worker-to-worker education committee that comes on grower property, on company time, at least once a harvest cycle, and engages in worker-to-worker education, has resulted in the creation of tens of thousands of worker monitors who are on the ground, knowing their own rights, enforcing them in the workplace every day, and then also relating in their interactions with the formal mechanisms of monitoring in the Fair Food Program, which are both the in-depth audits and the 24-hour complaint mechanism that is the work of the Fair Food Standards Council, and I'll go into that a little bit more in a moment. But one thing that I want to make really clear in all of this is that despite incredibly good standards and worker education so that workers really know their rights, including the right to complain without retaliation, having an on-the-ground monitoring organization that's constantly supplying you with credible information, none of that would be meaningful without the prompt and effective market consequences of the now 14 corporate buyers that stand behind this program. And so all of our findings, all of our negotiation, all of our drafting of corrective actions would not get us very far past the attitude of the tractor doesn't tell a farmer how to farm if we did not have those market consequences standing behind us. And simply put, for a zero tolerance offense, growers simply cannot sell now to buyers that represent well over 20% of their market. So that is very extremely meaningful and impactful. Next slide, please. So the Fair Food Standards Council and the monitoring organization of the program is an on the ground, and I just wanted to amplify a little bit the explanation that was given in the beginning, because this program now is far beyond Florida. It is in 6 additional states up the East Coast, and it is opening the path in yet another state, a border state. And it also is has now entered 2 additional crops and is poised to enter several more. So the on-the-ground monitoring is far from confined to Florida. Next slide. The Fair Food, it was recognized very early on that a different kind of audit had to be done if you were really going to root out firmly entrenched abuses. So in addition to interviewing all levels of management, from the boardroom to the crew boss who is out with the workers every day to find out what management thinks they've put in place as opposed to what the field level supervisors actually do, we also interview at least 50% of the workforce at any given location. That means we ride the buses, we're at housing, we're in the fields, and we do not end our audit until that metric has been met, and in most cases it goes well beyond 50%. That is also what a worker-driven social responsibility program should be about, is getting that voice and the greatest possible feedback from workers in order to verify findings. And so all of that is taken back. We generate reports, comprehensive reports that measure what we find in the fields against the code, and corrective action plans are drafted and negotiated with the growers every year. And we return to these farms as often as necessary in order to ensure either compliance or that they will move forward to suspension. But even the best audit, next slide. Even the best audit is really just a snapshot of a moment in time. So to supplement that snapshot, we have really a 24-hour video feed onto the farms, if you will, and that is our complaint line that is answered live by our bi- and trilingual investigators, and always are resolved promptly, 80% in a month or under. And these are auditors who are familiar with the conditions on the farm. So between those two, we get a very good idea of what is going on. It's the opposite of a cold call center. And our complaint resolution time, as I said, really takes seriously that justice delayed for migrant workers in particular is justice denied. Over 50% are resolved in 2 weeks and 80% in under a month. Next slide. And what has all of this brought about? I don't have to read you these results. You can see them for yourself, but it is remarkable that some of the worst long entrenched offenses that CIW had built an entire career fighting and prosecuting have now been eliminated, and it really did not take that long. The worst actors and the worst practices have now been eliminated, as well as systemic wage theft. I think we're going to hit close to $30 million in Fair Food Program premium that has been distributed and to workers, and really the best encapsulation of it is workers telling us that they can work a gusto, they can work feeling at ease, they're feel good to come to work in a workplace where their dignity is respected. So I will leave it there and in your minds, the impact of prompt and effective enforcement. And this program uses the power of the purchasing order that the growers value the most in order to make that point and bring about these results.
All right. Go ahead.
Oh no, Greg, are you going to go?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, he is.
We've got 5 more minutes to wrap up.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah, here we go. Okay. So Eduardo, could you go to the next slide?
Okay, we kind of went over that with Judge Laura, so let's go to the next slide and I'll start there. Okay. So my job is luckily kind of the easiest, which is to take what Gerardo and Judge Laura said and pull out the key lessons learned, and then look at some of the challenges and opportunities ahead of us. If there's anything you come away with from this presentation, it's that there are two primary keys to the success of the Fair Food Program. First is, and foremost, is worker participation from start to finish. As Gerardo said, that includes everything from writing the code of conduct over a number of years before we even had a chance to implement the Fair Food Program, to holding the agreements with the brands, the legally binding agreements with the brands that are used to enforce the standards in the code and make them real. So everything in between those 2 points, writing the codes and enforcing the codes, workers are involved in every step of the way. That's absolutely essential to the success of the program. The second, as Judge Laura emphasized, was the market consequences, the market-based enforcement. Through what they call in business the power of the PO, the power of the purchasing order. Now, the purchasing order has been used for years to change conditions in the supply chain, mainly around issues like food safety. After a number of very high-profile E. coli and salmonella outbreaks, it became an existential issue for the corporations, for the brands who sell food to consumers, that food not kill their clients. And it was doing that. It was getting a lot of coverage in the press. So they leaned on their suppliers through the power of their purchasing order to require them to meet and prove that they are certified as food safety operations. And that's, in fact, essentially the same model that we used here. It simply didn't come from the interest from the top of the industry, and the interest of the corporation is to sell to consumers, but from the bottom of the industry and the interest of workers to lead a dignified life at work and not face the kind of abuses that had either described for decades. The diagram here explains in graphic form the way that workers are involved in every step. If you take the top circle, the worker-driven circle, and the left circle, consumer-powered, the overlap there is where workers are organizing with consumers to pressure brands to sign binding legal agreements with the workers' organization, the CIW. You do the same move to the right, the worker-driven and the Fair Food Certified. The overlap there is where the CIW, in turn, is working hand in hand with the Fair Food Standards Council to monitor and enforce the Fair Food Code of Conduct and to educate workers so that all the workers under the Fair Food Program protections know their rights and what to do if they're violated. And workers at the center of that, 35,000 workers, are the frontline monitors of their own rights in the field through the complaint mechanism, which we now have well over 2,000 complaints and counting that we've processed, and through cooperation with the audits, which themselves have already, I believe, generated 6,000 and more than 6,000 audit findings that have been corrected over the 7th season. With education, the worker-to-worker education taking place ahead of the audit visits so that workers can be active and informed participants in the audit process. In the end, the second key, the market-based enforcement, the ability for the program to suspend growers for failure to correct violations established in the agreements between the CIW and the brands, and which is implemented by the brands in the case of zero tolerance violations or the failure to comply with a corrective action plan. That is the teeth behind the monitoring and corrective action plans that make the standards real rather than just aspirational. So those two elements, worker participation from start to finish and market-based enforcement through the power of the purchasing order, are what make this program tick. Next slide, Eduardo. We can go through this quickly. These are just some of the forms of recognition that the program has received due to its success in stopping things like modern-day slavery and sexual assault in the field. It's been from everywhere from the White House to the United Nations that they have recognized the power of this model to actually make real concrete change for workers on the ground. Just this morning, we received another invitation from Geneva to go and present on the program and be part of a process that they're doing to focus on the UN guiding principles and to provide guidance in corporate supply chains to do real accountability and remedy for workers when their rights are violated. That just is a good demonstration of how even globally this program, which was born of a community, as Gerardo described, which is one of the poorest communities in this country, has reached the attention of human rights defenders across the globe. Next slide, and we'll finish here. Eduardo? Yeah, thank you. In terms of the opportunities, the program itself is expanded up in 7 states and 2 crops, but both of those numbers will be changing shortly. And it has been replicated, most importantly, and there are 2 places that the worker-driven social responsibility model is now being practiced outside of the Fair Food Program. One is in Vermont in the dairy industry, where the changes have already started to happen on the farms, long overdue changes for dairy workers. And the other is in Bangladesh in the apparel industry, where the Bangladesh Accord for Fire and Building Safety has fundamentally changed the landscape of work safety for 2.5 million workers there, and saved countless workers' lives. Workers who in the past, because of fear of retaliation if they were to complain, or being fired if they were to refuse to go into unsafe factories, were forced to go into factories they knew were unsafe, and that then collapsed, not allowing those workers, killing those workers, not allowing their children to ever see them again, not allowing them to return home that evening because no one was there. The workers had no power to enforce their own rights in the workplace. With this model, with brands signing on to legally binding agreements through the Accord, they now have the power to not only let the companies know when they see problems for safety in their factories, and not be afraid of being fired for taking that stand, but also to require the companies to fix those problems or lose business with those brands. So I'll stop there. This will say that the one challenge, the primary challenge we face for expansion, is the fact that this is real social responsibility that requires real change on the part of not just the growers or the suppliers, but on the part of the brands as well. And since it requires brand participation to help motivate suppliers to join, and brands recognize that there are other programs out there that don't require real change like this one does, we are constantly climbing uphill to expand the program. But it's working, it's growing, and we think that in the next 2-3 years, there will be almost an exponential expansion of not just the Fair Food Program, but of the worker-driven social responsibility model.
Okay, thank you so much. That was incredibly informative, and I see that we have some questions. So before we cut to the questions, maybe could we just quickly see the results of the poll?
Sure. So Janice, it's Pranitha. So just to say, for the very first question, do you currently conduct any form of monitoring, including compliance monitoring as an agency? 67% of the respondents said yes, 33% said no. For the second question, do you ever require third-party monitoring and settlement provisions? 6% said yes, 94% said no.
Okay, great. So what we'd like to do is move to the questions. And let me just say that when we come back to Judge Laura and Greg and Gerardo, maybe we could just ask you to be thinking a big picture question, which is, how do you think that the lessons from this program translate for public agencies in terms of what you would advise them in terms of how they do investigations, compliance monitoring, enforcement, how they work with organizations, et cetera. And maybe for us, right, to encourage agencies to think about how you are currently engaging in monitoring and how this might impact how you think about these things, and what questions might be useful for you to have answered by our presenters. So Pranitha, do you want to turn to the questions?
Yes, thank you. So the very first question is and this seems like it might be to all the presenters. So it's, in what other industries do you think this model could work?
I can take that. I don't think there's really a limit to the industry. I don't think it's the nature of the industry that would limit its expansion or its replication. I think it's, you have to have certain elements in place. This is a supply chain model, so it's at the bottom of corporate supply chain. So you need some sort of brand at the top that is a public brand that is concerned about its image, about the value of its brand. And if the conditions at the bottom of the supply chain that need to be changed can be connected to that brand, then that brand is going to need to respond to that as a public challenge. And that's how this program got off the ground. But there's millions of workers around the globe who work in structures like that. So that's one element. The other, though, unfortunately, there's no model that covers everything. And this model requires workers to have the freedom to play their role as active participants in building and monitoring the program. There are places, clearly, Mexico comes to mind immediately because it's a major produce competitor with the United States, where because of the failure of civil society, the degree of corruption and violence in the country, and the powerlessness of the poor, and you don't get more poor than people who travel to work in the field. It's not realistic to think that in most situations in Mexico that this kind of program will work given that context. So there are some limitations to where it can go, but there are tens of millions of workers currently working here in the U.S. and in other countries who could absolutely implement this program with the proper orientation and background.
Great, thank you. And that, just to clarify, that question came from Ellen Love in San Francisco. The next question is from Terry Gerstein, and the question is, how do you think a government agency could adapt or use aspects of this model in government enforcement?
Laura, do you want to try that one?
Yeah, sure. Well, for one, we do think that working where organizations that have been in the community and like CIW and like the Fair Food Program, to reach out to local community organizations who do have their ear to the ground and do have trust built over many years of organizing, can be a very mutually enriching relationship. For example, when our hotline, Greg is right, and I think the slides were one slide behind where I thought they were, but our hotline taken thousands of calls over these 7 seasons, and we resolved well over 2,000 complaints. But we get a lot of calls from outside the Fair Food Program, where our investigators are able to go in and speak to workers and get good accounts from them, but they cannot enforce. We cannot enforce our kinds of resolutions or complaint process because we don't have the agreements in place in those growers. And in those situations, we do work very collaboratively with government agencies. So that's one thing that I think is productive. The other thing that I think is something that I believe DOL has been looking at very seriously is to think about sanctions that involve the PO, as Greg said, and as the industry calls it, models of enforcement that don't resolve themselves only in a fine, but in the impact in the supplier's ability to sell up their supply chain, which is really the most impactful for them in many circumstances. And last but not least, I guess, because I know that agencies do periodic audits and they also take complaints, but these processes are not necessarily integrated, and they're not necessarily staffed by the same people, people who know the conditions and people who are familiar, who form like a hot bench, as we would call it, who really don't have to start from scratch in knowing the terrain and knowing the workforce and the problems that they are facing. So where that sharing of information, if not staff, can happen, that would be very critical. And there may be some things that I could suggest that are beyond your power to implement, but for us, certainly having the ability to respond to workers 24/7 is what makes a huge difference. Just a huge difference. It's going to be a very small minority of workers who call you during the workday with their employer on, in their immediate surroundings. So those are some of the suggestions. Some of them may be practical for you and some may not, but that's from our experience.
Thank you. The next question comes from Susan Nord, and the question is, do you have a seasonal workforce? And if so, how is monitoring programs structured to ensure worker participation?
Yeah. I will respond to that one. The season here in Florida starts in November, the height of the season. Anyways, people start to come back around mid of September. So it's pretty much like October to May or June, depending on which company we're talking about. Companies have land all over the southwest part, but also the central part of the state. And then there are some farms that are scattered on the East Coast and then the border between Georgia and Florida. And then those same companies have land all over the East Coast. So we're talking about a workforce that, yes, is temporary if you think about Florida only, but many of them are also permanent workers that try to follow the season, especially now with the implementation of the Fair Food Program, because workers are respected. So when you see that, the best practices in terms of implementation of the provisions of the program result in people wanting to continue to work as much as possible with the same farms. There's a direct correlation with that. So we have these workforce that in the north can change a little bit. There's sometimes workers that are local, but there's many workers that follow the season. So it is year-round for many, not all, but a good number of workers that work most of the year here in Florida during the. It's two seasons that basically are sitting next to each other. That makes it like a 8-month period of work for workers. So how we ensure participation? We ensure participation because we go to every farm. We educate every worker, and that is not it. What makes it work is that when we talk with the workers about the rights they have in the fields and the fact that we are collaborating with the company to ensure that those rights are implemented and respected. Workers, at the beginning were a little shy, but not for long. So complaints started to flow a little bit slowly, but then once the workers started to complain, and then other workers saw that they were not fired, that there was no retaliation, that they were not subjects of violence anymore. Then workers knew that the system in place was to be trusted, and then all of this started to allow for hundreds of through the system, allowing for a transformation of the industry.
Yeah, and I would just add, I saw that this kind of flows into somebody else's question, I believe, but the workers, as Gerardo was saying, go up the East Coast as soon as the growing season here is over. So we are seeing traveling crews in Georgia, North and South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and New Jersey, and the latest state that's being opened in the new initiative is Texas. But there is nothing specific about a particular crop or geographic region that should be limiting of this type of model or program. And just to also loop back on something Gerardo said in terms of the government agency role, in really workers seeing and believing that they are free to make complaints without retaliation, and that retaliation will be addressed promptly and swiftly with their employer, and that they will be back at work, and it will be the supervisor who wrongfully terminated them for raising a complaint who is in trouble. That's everything. If we hadn't been able to do that in our first few months of enforcement, our complaint line would have gone silent.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll only have time for one more question, and any additional questions that have been asked that haven't been answered, we will share it with the presenters and get those answers back to everyone as part of our follow-up. So the final question is from Nayantara Mehta, and it's, if it hasn't been addressed already, how is the program funded?
I can answer that. At the moment, it's funded in large part by foundations. There's also private individual donors in the donation category. We have, in our latest agreements, we have buyer payments that are not able to be stopped or withheld, and they're part of a binding legal agreement and evergreen, so they happen every year. So buyer payments for monitoring, and we're working on several other forms of financial support that will give us further independence from foundation funding, including the monetizing a label, the Fair Food Program label, which is a complicated process. We can't really get into exactly why it is here. There's not enough time, but because we essentially certify in our program both the buyer and the producer, that complicates it to a degree. And we're looking also at the sort of environmental movement model where supporters become sustainers. They become members and support through annual or monthly donations the work of the Fair Food Program. So there's a number of different ways we're looking to fund it, and at the moment it is largely foundation funded, not entirely, in part through industry annual payments and other individual donors, but we're looking to diversify that in the future.
Thanks very much.
I'm typing a last answer for your subcontracting, because I know that's critical for government agencies that are trying to enforce, and that really cannot happen. That was like why I started with the first standard that we enforce is direct hire. There is no subcontracting of employment, and there is no hand washing. Everything flows upstream to the top. And so
if it happens on your farm,
really profound.
For it.
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, we're going to need to close up, so let me just say a few things. First, a huge thank you to the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and to the Fair Food Standards Council for this incredibly informative webinar, and also for the amazing work you've done and the example that you have established. That's so powerful in the work you're doing to expand the model. And to say to all the public agencies, I think there are all kinds of lessons and ideas here for us, from thinking about the powers that agencies might consider, from joint employer powers to investigations, resources like forensic accountants, having our investigators be able to specialize in particular industries, thinking about the importance of being in deep relationship with employers, the way that the investigations have been investigators speak with so many workers, and the role of worker-to-worker education, which is why the complaint line works so well. I'll just end by saying that we're very interested in hearing what you all thought of this and any other additional questions. We have some material about the programs that we'll send out. And a couple of things just to mention. CLASP and CWO have a paper series that will be coming out shortly. We cover a paper on intake and triage, strategic enforcement, investigations, collections, joint employment, information sharing, settlement agreements, co-enforcement, and others. So we'll be releasing those papers shortly, and we'll be offering a module, a training module, 3.5 hours at ILSA on August 23rd at the Interstate Labor Standards Association annual meeting. We'll be offering a training on August 23rd on strategic enforcement. So we hope to see you all there. We thank you very much for participating, and please let us know your suggestions for additional webinars in the future. The next 2 webinars will be about expanding enforcement capacity and planning, measuring, and evaluating impact. Thank you very much.